The chalk was cold in her fingers. That was the first thing Rose noticed when she stepped into the schoolroom that January morning. Not the creak of the floorboards, not the hush of the empty desks, but the bitter, dry cold of the chalk she picked up from the tray. It felt like holding a small piece of winter itself, pale and fragile and apt to crumble. She set it back down carefully and pulled her coat tighter, then turned to the wood stove in the corner and began the slow work of coaxing a fire from the few sticks of kindling left in the box. Outside, Silver Creek, Idaho, pressed itself flat under a gray January sky. The mountains wore their snow like a judgment. Smoke from a dozen chimneys rose and disappeared into the clouds, as if the town itself were trying to disappear. Rose Calloway had arrived 6 days ago on the afternoon stage, her single trunk strapped to the roof, and her letter of appointment from the school board folded into the pocket of her coat. She was 26 years old. She had come from Boise, where her mother's sister had taken her in after her teaching post in Caldwell ended. Politely, the board there had said, due to budget constraints, though she suspected the real reason was the foreman's wife, who had never liked the way her husband tipped his hat in the street. It did not matter now. Silver Creek needed a teacher. Rose needed work and a roof. Those two needs had met on paper, and here she was, breathing fog into a cold schoolroom, and wondering if the stovepipe was drawing properly. She did not yet know about the man who lived 3 miles east of town. She did not know about his daughter. She did not know that the woman buried in the churchyard since November, the woman the preacher had spoken over in a thin, hurrying voice because the ground was already half frozen, had been that man's wife. She did not know any of that yet. Before that winter was out, she would know all of it, and before spring fully arrived, she would be braiding that little girl's hair by the light of a kitchen window, with something warm and frightened and entirely unexpected beginning to grow in her chest. Walter Crane had not meant to come into town that day. He had a list of things he needed: flour, lamp oil, a new axle bolt for the wagon, and he had been putting the trip off for 2 weeks, telling himself the weather was not right, telling himself Lily could wait another few days before she needed new bootlaces, telling himself a dozen things that were not the truth. The truth was that every time he hitched the horse and pointed it toward Silver Creek, he passed the churchyard at the edge of town, and he was not ready for that yet. But Lily had woken that morning crying in a quiet, determined way that she had developed since November. Not loud, not dramatic, just a steady, resigned weeping that was somehow harder to bear than any tantrum. He had sat on the edge of her bed in the half-dark and held her small hand and said, with more certainty than he felt, "I'm going to town today. You want to come?" She had stopped crying and looked at him with her mother's brown eyes. She was 4 years old. She said, "Can we get peppermints?" He said yes, so they went. He drove past the churchyard without looking at it. He had learned that if he kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his jaw set, and his hands steady on the reins, he could make it through. He was a man who had survived a great deal by keeping his eyes on what was directly in front of him. He had built his house that way. He had run his 30 head of cattle through 2 hard winters that way. He had gotten through the last 2 months that way. Lily sat beside him on the bench, wrapped in her mother's old quilt. He had not been able to keep her from sleeping with it. Her boots dangling above the footboard, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The town appeared ahead, gray and familiar and smelling of wood smoke and horses. He pulled up in front of Hadley's General Store, set the brake, and lifted Lily down. She immediately pressed her face against the window to look at the jars of candy inside. He went around to tie the horse, and when he turned back, he saw a woman coming out of the building next to the store, the schoolhouse, which had been empty since old Mr. Fitch had left in October. She was carrying an armload of firewood, clearly struggling with the weight of it, her breath coming in quick clouds. She had dark hair pulled back under a wool hat, and her coat was a little too thin for January in Silver Creek. She made it 3 steps before the top log began to slide. Walter crossed the distance without thinking about it, the way a person moves toward a stumbling horse or a tipping pail. Not from gallantry, exactly, but from a kind of practical reflex. He caught the log before it hit the ground. She looked up at him. Her eyes were a steady gray-green, like river water in autumn, and she did not look embarrassed at being caught in difficulty. She looked, if anything, mildly irritated at the log. "Thank you," she said, and that was all. She had a way of saying two words that made them feel complete, like a sentence that required nothing added. He nodded. He noticed that her gloves had a hole in the right thumb. He picked up the remaining logs from the ground and said, "I'll carry these in." It was not a question. She considered him for a moment and then stepped aside to let him through the door. The schoolroom was not warm yet, but it was getting there. Walter stacked the wood beside the stove with the efficiency of a man who had built and tended fires his entire life, and Rose watched him do it without pretending to look elsewhere, the way some women might. She was a practical person, and she watched practical things being done with a certain satisfaction. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with the particular economy of movement that comes from years of hard outdoor work. He wore no scarf, and his coat was a good one, but not new. There was mud on his boots from the road, and his hands, she noticed, were not the hands of a man who spent time indoors. He finished stacking the wood and stood up and looked at the stove. "You need to angle the damper," he said. "It'll draw better," he showed her, adjusting the small iron lever. Smoke stopped curling back into the room. Rose felt the air change almost immediately. "I'm Rose Calloway," she said. "The new teacher." "I know," he said. "Word gets around." He said it without warmth or coldness, simply as a fact. "Walter Crane. I have a spread east of town." He hesitated, and she saw something shift behind his eyes, a brief shadow, like a cloud crossing a field. "My daughter was starting to ask about school. She's 4. A little young yet, maybe. She can come," Rose said, because it was true. "I take them from 3 onward. Young ones sit in the front and listen. It's good for them." He looked at her then, directly, in a way men in her experience did not usually look at a woman they had just met. Not with interest of that kind, not with assessment, but with something closer to honest evaluation, as though she had said something that required him to reconsider a previous position. "She'd be a lot of trouble," he said. "She talks." Rose almost smiled. "They all talk," she said. "That's rather the point." He picked up his hat, which he had set on a desk when he came in. He started toward the door, and then he stopped, his hand on the frame, his back still to her. He said without turning around, "She doesn't have a mother. Since November." He said it plainly, the way a man states the depth of a river before crossing it, not asking for sympathy, only providing necessary information. Rose was quiet for a moment. Outside, the cold pressed against the single window. The stove ticked and breathed. "I'll watch out for her," she said. That was all she said. It was enough. He put his hat on and walked out, and through the window she watched him collect a small, quilt-wrapped figure from the general store window and lift her into the wagon. The little girl said something that made Walter look down at her, and Rose could not hear the words through the glass, but she saw his face change. Just briefly, just a flicker, into something less carefully contained. Then he climbed up and drove away, and Rose turned back to her stove, and her cold chalk and her new life. The first morning Lily Crane appeared in the schoolhouse. She arrived 40 minutes before the other children, seated on the front step like she had been placed there by the hand of Providence, wearing a coat that was buttoned wrong and a pair of braids that had clearly been attempted by someone with great love and very little practice. Rose opened the door and looked down at her. Lily looked up. Her father was already halfway back up the road, which told Rose that the little girl had come in on her own initiative and that Walter Crane had decided to trust the situation rather than negotiate it. That, she thought, said something about him. "You're Lily," Rose said. "I'm Rose." "That's a flower name," Lily said, with the gravity of a 4-year-old delivering important information. "It is," Rose agreed. "Come inside before you freeze." Lily came inside and sat in the front row seat and looked at everything in the room with the focused, rotating attention of a child who has been lonely and is trying very hard not to show it. Rose rebuttoned her coat without making a thing of it. Lily allowed this with the dignified tolerance of someone accustomed to accepting necessary help. The other children arrived in ones and twos, stomping snow from their boots, filling the room with noise and cold air, and the specific smell of children in winter, wool and wood smoke and something sweetly animal. Lily watched them all and said nothing until a boy named Thomas Hadley sat down beside her and announced at full volume that her braids looked funny. Rose was at the board, writing the date. She did not turn around. She said, "At normal volume, Thomas, in this room we use our words to build people up, not to knock them down. That is the first lesson today and every day." There was a silence. Then Thomas said carefully, "I like your coat." Lily considered this and said, "Thank you. It was my mother's." The room went very quiet for a moment, that particular quiet that falls when children absorb something they do not fully understand, but recognize as serious. Rose turned around then and met Lily's eyes, and the little girl's chin was up and her expression was composed in a way that was unmistakably her father's, and something in Rose's chest pulled tight and did not let go. After school, she asked Lily to wait a moment. She sat the child on the front desk and carefully undid the uneven braids and redid them, not too tight, not too loose, pinned properly with 2 of her own spare pins. Lily sat very still during this operation, with the focused solemnity of someone receiving a great kindness and trying to be worthy of it. "Can you do this tomorrow?" Lily asked when it was done. Rose hesitated. She thought of Walter Crane and his careful plainness, his statement about his wife delivered like a measurement. She thought of the hole in the thumb of her own glove. She thought of her rent at the boarding house, which was due at the end of February, and which, even with her teaching salary, was going to require careful arithmetic. "You'll have to ask your father," Rose said. "I'll ask him," Lily said, with a certainty that suggested the matter was settled. Walter came to the schoolhouse that Friday afternoon, at the end of the week, to collect Lily himself. He stood in the doorway while Lily gathered her things, taking in the room with those quiet, evaluating eyes. Rose was erasing the board. She kept erasing it. He said, "She talks about you." "She's a talker," Rose said. "Always was," he said, and there was both sorrow and affection in it. Then, after a pause, "She asked me about the hair braiding." Rose set the eraser down and turned. She was not a woman who let things circle when they could be addressed directly. "I can do it in the mornings before school, if she arrives a bit early. It's no hardship." He looked at her with that same quality of honest assessment she had noticed the first day. "I'd pay you," he said. "You don't need to pay me for braiding a child's hair, Mr. Crane. I pay for what I use," he said. It was not argumentative. It was simply a principle, stated plainly, in the same way he had stated everything else. Rose studied him for a moment. The afternoon light came thin and gray through the window behind him. His hat was in his hands. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been putting one foot in front of the other for a very long time and was very tired, but who did not believe in stopping. "All right," she said. $1 a week," he nodded. "I'll bring her Mondays through Fridays, 7 in the morning." 7 is fine. He put his hat on. He called to Lily, and Lily came running, her new braids bouncing, and she took her father's hand with the easy confidence of a child who does not doubt that the hand will be there. Rose watched them go. Outside, the cold was settling again, the brief afternoon light already dying. She stood at the window for a moment after their wagon had turned up the road, her hand resting on the sill. The glass was cold under her fingers. The boarding house room waited for her, small and quiet, and she thought, not for the first time, that there was a particular kind of loneliness that had nothing to do with being alone, and a particular kind of warmth that had nothing to do with a fire. She went back to erasing the board. February came in hard. A storm swept down from the north and pinned Silver Creek under 2 feet of snow for 10 days, and school was canceled for most of the second week. Rose spent the time at the boarding house, mending her clothes and reading the 2 books she had brought from Boise and rereading them. She was running low on lamp oil. The boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Plunkett, was warm enough but thin on comfort. The meals were adequate, the walls were thin, and the price was going up in March by 20 cents a week, which Mrs. Plunkett had mentioned twice in the same conversation. Rose had done the arithmetic. Her salary from the school board was $40 a month, which was fair by Silver Creek standards. But the boarding house at its new rate, plus her meals, plus lamp oil and soap and thread, left almost nothing for the unexpected, and teaching contracts in Idaho Territory in 1893 were renewed semester by semester, not year by year. It was not panic she felt, sitting in her room with the wind shouting at the window. It was the particular, practical anxiety of a woman who has learned that security is not given but made, and who can see clearly that she has not yet made enough of it. On the 3rd day of the storm, there was a knock at the boarding house door. Mrs. Plunkett called up the stairs that Mr. Crane was asking for Rose, and Rose came down to find Walter on the porch with snow on his shoulders and Lily pressed against his leg, both of them rosy-cheeked from the cold. He had brought a side of salt pork and a sack of flour and a small jar of honey because, Lily announced, "Papa said you probably hadn't been able to get to the store." Rose stood in the doorway and looked at the salt pork and felt, for reasons she could not immediately explain, the thread of tears behind her eyes, which she did not permit. She stepped back and said, "Come in, out of the cold." Walter said, "We can't stay long. Roads are bad. Stay long enough for coffee," she said. He came in. They sat at Mrs. Plunkett's kitchen table, Mrs. Plunkett finding urgent business elsewhere, as landladies do, and Lily sat between them, eating one of Mrs. Plunkett's sugar cookies and telling Rose in great detail about a horse named Biscuit, who had broken his fence post in the storm and gotten into the hay barn. And Walter sat with his coffee and said almost nothing, but he did not seem to need to. It was one of the easier silences Rose had ever sat in. When they stood to leave, Walter turned his hat in his hands and said, without preamble, "I have a proposal for you. I'd like you to think on it." Rose waited. "The house has a room," he said. "It was going to be a study. It's got a window and a stove that draws. Lily needs—" He stopped and looked at his daughter, who was helping herself to a second cookie with the skilled casualness of a child betting she will not be noticed. He looked back at Rose. "She needs more than I know how to give her," he said. "I'm asking if you'd consider room and board at the house, in exchange for the mornings and the evenings with her. The teaching is separate. I'd still pay that." He said it with the same measurement and depth plainness of everything else, and Rose understood that this was a man who had considered the proposal carefully before making it, and who would receive her refusal with the same quiet dignity. Rose asked the practical questions. How many rooms in the house? Was there a lock on the door? What were his expectations? Was there a church she could attend on Sundays? He answered each one. She asked about the school board, whether having her board with a widower would cause talk. He said there would be talk regardless, and that she should decide based on what was practical, not on what would keep Mrs. Plunkett's table from gossiping. She asked one more thing. She asked, plainly, whether this was a permanent arrangement or a seasonal one. Walter looked at her. Lily had gone very quiet in the way children do when they understand the conversation is important. "I'd like it to be permanent," he said, "if it suits." Rose moved her trunk to Walter Crane's house on the first clear day after the storm, which was a Thursday in late February. Mrs. Plunkett did not say anything unkind, but she did say a great deal in general about the imprudence of young women and the opinions of towns, which Rose received with the patience of someone who has heard the speech before, under different names. The room in Walter's house was indeed small, with a window that faced east and let in the morning light in a way that was almost enough to forgive everything else about the frontier. The stove drew well. There was a shelf above the desk that Walter had built. She could tell from the fit of the joints that he had done it himself, and done it carefully. She set her 2 books on it and her small framed photograph of her mother, and that made it, if not home, then at least a room that was hers. Lily showed her the house with the pride of a tour guide, which meant Rose was introduced to every room twice, the horse Biscuit through the barn window, and a particular stone by the back step that Lily had designated as important. The kitchen had a real range, not just a box stove, and a window over the washing basin that looked out toward the mountain, and Rose stood at it for a moment longer than was necessary. In the mornings, Lily came to her room before light, and Rose braided her hair while Lily talked, and Walter made breakfast, oatmeal or cornmeal, eggs when there were eggs, twice a week sourdough biscuits that were better than anything Rose had eaten at the boarding house. He set her plate at the table without ceremony, just as he set Lily's, and the 3 of them ate together in the gray morning light with the range ticking and the mountains out the window, and after 10 days of it, Rose realized she had stopped doing the arithmetic before she went to sleep. The town talked. Naturally it did. Mrs. Plunkett spoke to the Reverend Alcott, who was a fair man, and said privately that a child needed a woman in the house and publicly said nothing at all. The Hadley wives debated it at the store counter. Walter went to town once a week and came back without mentioning it, and Rose did not ask, because she had decided that the arrangement was honest, and she was not in the habit of defending honest things to people who did not understand them. What she had not decided, what she was actively not permitting herself to examine too closely, was the feeling that came upon her sometimes in the evenings, when Walter sat by the fire with Lily in his lap, and read to her from the Bible, or from one of his 2 ranch catalogs, or from Rose's own books, which he had borrowed with a brief, entirely unself-conscious request. He read well. He read with attention. Lily fell asleep against his chest at regular intervals, and he continued reading anyway, in a lower voice, as though the story needed finishing even if the audience had gone to sleep. Rose sat across the fire with her own mending, and tried very hard to attend to the thread. March arrived with mud and the particular sharp smell of earth coming back to itself after a long cold. Rose had been at the Crane house for just over 3 weeks when the letter came from the school board, delivered by the postal rider who came through Silver Creek on Wednesdays. She read it at the kitchen table, while Walter repaired harness leather at the other end, and Lily napped in her room. The letter informed her that a member of the school board, a Mr. Gould, who had recently acquired several parcels of land east of town through what the letter described as standard business arrangements, but which Walter had described to her once, briefly, as squeeze and foreclose, had raised questions about the propriety of the current teaching arrangement. He suggested that Miss Calloway's continued employment was conditional on her returning to appropriate lodgings. The letter was polite in the way that threats delivered by committee are always polite, which is to say it was not polite at all. Rose read it twice and set it on the table. She looked out the window at the mountain, which was showing its first bare patches of dark rock through the snow, and was quiet for a moment. Then she told Walter. He read the letter. He read it the way he read everything, without visible expression, steadily, from top to bottom. Then he set it down. Gould, he said. It was not a question. He's been after my east pasture since last autumn, Walter said. He couldn't get at me through the land, so he's trying another door. He was quiet for a moment. Rose said, I don't want you to think I expect you to fight my battles. He looked up at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite amusement, but somewhere between the two. I know you don't, he said. Then, after a pause, without looking away, there's another arrangement. I've thought about it. I wasn't... He stopped. He set the letter down and straightened it with 2 fingers, which was, she had come to understand, what he did when he was choosing words carefully. I wasn't going to say this yet. I don't want you to think this is about Gould, because it isn't. It's been in my mind since February, maybe before." Rose waited. The range ticked. Outside, a meadowlark, the first of the season, called once from somewhere near the barn. "I'm asking you to marry me," Walter said. "Not to fix a letter, and not because of the town. Because Lily trusts you, and he stopped again. "Because I trust you," he said. "And because this house is better with you in it, and I think we both know it." It was possibly the least poetic proposal Rose had ever read about, and almost certainly the most honest one she had ever received. She sat with it for a moment. The meadowlark called again. "I do know it," she said. That was her answer. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his big, work-worn, capable hand, which had carried firewood into her schoolroom in January, and lifted Lily down from the wagon bench 100 times, and built the shelf above her desk with quiet, unnecessary care. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. When Lily woke from her nap and came barefoot into the kitchen dragging her quilt, she found them still sitting that way, and she looked at their joined hands with 4-year-old gravity and said, "Are we having supper soon?" Walter laughed. A real laugh, brief and unguarded, the first Rose had heard from him, low and genuine as the creek in spring thaw. Rose laughed too. "Yes," she said, "we are having supper soon." She stood and went to the range and began it, and the kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of good food, and Walter watched her from the table, with something in his face that was neither careful nor contained. They were married by Reverend Alcott on the last Saturday of March, in the church that smelled of pine and old hymn books and cold stone warming in the first real sun of the year. Lily wore her best dress and her braids pinned with the good pins, and she stood between them at the altar and held both their hands, and when the Reverend said the words that made the thing official, Lily looked up at Rose with those brown eyes and said, in a carrying whisper, "Now you're mine." The congregation, small, Silver Creek being a small town, heard every word. Reverend Alcott smiled. Rose pressed the little hand in hers and said quietly, "Yes, now I'm yours." Walter did not say anything, but he had hold of both of them, and his grip was steady and certain, the way a man holds something he means to keep. Spring came all at once that year, the way it does in the Idaho mountains. 1 week snow, the next week mud, and then almost overnight the meadows greening and the creek running full, and the air smelling of something that had nothing to do with winter anymore. Rose taught school through April and May, and Lily sat in the front row every day and was, as Walter had predicted, a great deal of trouble in the very best sense. Too curious, too vocal, never intentionally unkind, always the first to notice when something interesting was happening outside the window. On the mornings when they rode to school together, Lily sat between Rose and Walter on the wagon bench, her braids fresh and even, and she narrated the road from the house to the town in the way she narrated everything, thoroughly. Walter drove and listened, and sometimes he glanced across Lily's head to Rose with an expression that had become familiar, quiet and grateful and still a little wondering, as if he had not entirely gotten used to the fact of this and was in no hurry to. They built a second room that summer off the back of the house, which Walter had said was for storage, and which Rose understood, watching him work, was for what came next. He added a second chair to the porch. Small things, steady things, the kind of things that do not announce themselves but that, over time, make a life. Gould withdrew his letter in April, under circumstances that Reverend Alcott described to Rose as the kind of quiet community persuasion that towns sometimes find when they decide they like their schoolteacher. She did not ask for details, she did not need to. She was at her kitchen window one morning in May, the window that faced the mountain, Lily's voice coming from the yard below where she was conducting some important investigation among the rocks by the back step, and Walter's voice answering her in that low, steady way of his, and the coffee was hot, and the mountain was green at its feet and brown and white above. And Rose thought, this is the thing that was always meant to be built. Not promised, not wished for, built, board by board, morning by morning, one practical act of care at a time. She set her cup down and went outside to join them, in the good spring light. There is something to be said for the arrangements we fall into out of necessity, and the way necessity sometimes has better sense than planning. Walter Crane went to town for flour and lamp oil and came home with something he had not put on his list. Rose Calloway arrived in Silver Creek with a letter of appointment and a coat too thin for winter, and found, in the end, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. And Lily, little Lily, who said, "Now you're mine," at a church altar in the hearing of the whole town, she is perhaps the truest example of what this kind of story is really about. It is not about how love begins, so much as how it is tended, how it shows up with firewood, how it asks practical questions, how it braids a child's hair by morning light and calls it no hardship. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below and tell us, was there a moment when you knew the bargain had become something more? Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more journeys like this one, told the way stories deserve to be told, slowly and with care. Good night. God bless you, and the ones you are building a life with, whoever they may be.